8-year-old Zoe walked down Pine Street with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. The afternoon sun felt warm on her face as she made her way home from Lincoln Elementary School. She hummed a song her music teacher had taught them that morning, completely lost in her own little world. Zoe loved this walk home. It gave her time to think about her day, and sometimes she would stop to watch the squirrels chase each other up the oak trees that lined the sidewalk. Her mom always told her to come straight home after school, but Zoe never minded. The neighborhood felt safe and familiar. As she turned the corner onto Maple Avenue, something caught her attention. About 50 feet ahead, she saw an older woman sitting on the ground next to the sidewalk. Her gray hair was messy and she looked confused. Grocery bags were scattered around her, with apples and cans rolling in different directions. Zoe slowed down her walking. She had been taught not to talk to strangers, but the woman looked like she needed help. Before Zoe could decide what to do, she heard the sound of footsteps jogging toward the scene. A police officer appeared running from across the street. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle face. His uniform was neat and his badge caught the sunlight as he moved. Zoe had seen police officers before, but something about this one seemed different. He wasn't rushing or looking stern like the officers she sometimes saw on television. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" the officer asked as he knelt down beside the woman. His voice was soft and caring, like how Zoe's dad spoke to her when she had a bad dream. The woman looked up at him with watery blue eyes. "I don't know what happened," she said in a shaky voice. "One minute I was walking and the next minute I was on the ground. Everything hurts." Zoe moved closer but stayed far enough away so she wouldn't be noticed. She hid behind a parked car and watched what was happening. Something told her this was important, though she didn't understand why. The police officer, whose name tag read Officer Rodriguez, carefully helped the woman sit up straighter. "Let's take this slow," he said. "Can you tell me your name?" "Betty," the woman replied. "Betty Wilson. I live just 2 blocks from here on Oak Street." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Wilson. I'm Officer Rodriguez. Can you wiggle your fingers and toes for me?" He watched carefully as she moved her hands and feet. "Good, that's very good. Do you remember falling?" Mrs. Wilson shook her head. "I remember buying groceries at Miller's Market. Then I was walking home and suddenly I was sitting here. My hip hurt something awful." Officer Rodriguez nodded and pulled out his radio. But instead of calling for backup or an ambulance right away, he did something that surprised Zoe. He took off his jacket and gently placed it around Mrs. Wilson's shoulders. "You might be in shock," he explained. "This will help keep you warm while we figure out what happened." Zoe watched as the officer began picking up the scattered groceries. He moved slowly and carefully, making sure not to rush. He found a bruised apple and examined it before placing it gently back in the bag. "I'm so embarrassed," Mrs. Wilson said. "I'm causing such a fuss." "Don't you worry about that for even 1 second," Officer Rodriguez replied with a smile. "This is exactly what I'm here for. Besides, I was just walking my beat and had nothing but time." This wasn't true, and Zoe could tell. She had seen him jogging from across the street like he was in the middle of something important. But he was being kind, and that made Zoe smile. Officer Rodriguez called for an ambulance, but he asked them to come without sirens so Mrs. Wilson wouldn't feel more upset. While they waited, he sat down on the sidewalk next to her, not caring that his uniform might get dirty. "Do you have family nearby?" he asked. "My daughter lives about 20 minutes away, but I don't want to bother her at work." "I think she'd want to know," Officer Rodriguez said gently. "Would you like me to call her?" Mrs. Wilson nodded and gave him her daughter's phone number. Zoe listened as he made the call, explaining the situation calmly and reassuring the daughter that her mother seemed okay, but should be checked by a doctor. The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, but Officer Rodriguez had made those 15 minutes feel like a conversation between old friends. He told Mrs. Wilson about his own grandmother, who had lived to be 96, and had fallen several times but always bounced back stronger than before. "My grandmother used to say that falling down just proves you're still moving forward in life," he said with a chuckle. Mrs. Wilson actually laughed at this, and Zoe could see some color returning to her cheeks. When the paramedics arrived, Officer Rodriguez helped them understand what had happened. He had organized all of Mrs. Wilson's groceries neatly and made sure her purse was secure. He even noticed that she had dropped her house keys and found them under a nearby bush. "Officer, you've been so kind," Mrs. Wilson said as the paramedics prepared to take her to the hospital. I don't know how to thank you. No thanks needed, he replied. But I noticed you dropped your purse when you fell. Would you like me to bring it to you at the hospital later? Would you? That would be wonderful. My medications are in there and my insurance cards. Consider it done. I'll stop by this evening after my shift ends. Zoe watched as the ambulance drove away with Mrs. Wilson inside. Officer Rodriguez stayed on the sidewalk for a few more minutes, making sure he hadn't missed any of her belongings. He found a grocery list that had blown against a fence and carefully folded it to return later. A few minutes after the ambulance left, a middle-aged woman came rushing down the street. She looked worried and kept checking her phone. Officer, I'm looking for my mother. Someone called about an accident? You must be Mrs. Wilson's daughter. I'm Officer Rodriguez. Your mother is fine, but she took a fall. The paramedics took her to Memorial Hospital as a precaution. The daughter looked relieved. Thank you for calling me. Was she badly hurt? She seems okay, just shaken up. Her hip was bothering her, but she was talking and moving around fine. The doctors will want to check her out thoroughly, though. I was so scared when I got the call. Thank you for staying with her. Officer Rodriguez smiled. That's what we're here for. I have her purse and some groceries she'll want. I was planning to bring them to the hospital later. You don't have to do that. I can take them. I promised her I would, and I like to keep my promises. Besides, I want to make sure she's doing well. Zoe had been watching this entire scene for almost an hour. She had never seen anything like it before. The police officers she had heard about at home were described very differently. Her parents and their friends often talked about being careful around police, about how they might not understand or might judge people unfairly. But Officer Rodriguez seemed like the kindest person she had ever seen. He treated Mrs. Wilson like she was his own grandmother. He didn't rush or act like helping her was a bother. He genuinely cared about making sure she was okay. As Officer Rodriguez finally walked away, Zoe realized she needed to get home before her parents started to worry. But she couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. She had seen something special, something that made her feel hopeful about the world. Later that evening, as Zoe sat at the dinner table with her parents, she wanted to tell them about Officer Rodriguez and Mrs. Wilson. But something held her back. She wasn't sure they would believe her, or maybe they would worry that she had been watching strangers instead of coming straight home from school. So Zoe kept the story to herself, tucked away like a precious secret. She had no idea that in just a few weeks, this memory would become the most important thing she had ever witnessed. 3 weeks had passed since Zoe witnessed Officer Rodriguez helping Mrs. Wilson on Maple Avenue. Life had returned to normal for the 8-year-old. She went to school, played with her friends, and walked the same route home every day. Sometimes she would look for Officer Rodriguez during her walk, hoping to see him helping someone else, but their paths never crossed again. On a Tuesday morning, everything changed. Zoe woke up to the sound of her parents talking in worried whispers in the kitchen. This was unusual because her mom and dad were typically cheerful in the mornings, chatting about their plans for the day while making breakfast. Did you hear what happened on Oak Street? Her mother, Carmen, was saying as Zoe padded into the kitchen in her pajamas. Her father, Michael, shook his head grimly. It's all over the news. That sweet old lady who lived in the blue house. Someone broke in and... He stopped talking when he noticed Zoe had entered the room. What happened to a lady? Zoe asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her parents exchanged glances. Nothing you need to worry about, sweetie, Carmen said quickly. Just some sad news in the neighborhood. But Zoe was curious now. At 8 years old, she was old enough to understand that her parents were trying to protect her from something serious. During breakfast, she listened carefully as they continued talking in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't paying attention. From what she could piece together, an elderly woman had been hurt in her home. The police were involved and everyone in the neighborhood was upset about it. At school that day, Zoe overheard teachers talking about the same thing. Mrs. Peterson, her third-grade teacher, was discussing it with another teacher during recess. Such a shame about Betty Wilson, Mrs. Peterson said. She was such a lovely woman. Always volunteered at the school book fairs. Zoe's heart skipped a beat. Betty Wilson. That was the name of the woman Officer Rodriguez had helped. The woman with the gray hair and the kind blue eyes who had fallen on the sidewalk. During lunch, Zoe's friend Ashley told her what she had heard from her older sister. Someone broke into this old lady's house and hurt her really bad, Ashley whispered. My sister says she died. The police think someone she knew did it because there was no sign of anyone breaking in. Zoe felt sick to her stomach. Mrs. Wilson was dead? The same Mrs. Wilson who had laughed at Officer Rodriguez's story about his grandmother? The woman who had been so worried about bothering her daughter? That afternoon, Zoe could barely concentrate on her schoolwork. When the final bell rang, she walked home more slowly than usual, her mind spinning with sad thoughts about Mrs. Wilson. As she turned onto Pine Street, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. There were police cars everywhere. Not just one or two, but 5 or 6, all with their lights flashing. Officers in uniform were talking in serious groups, and some were carrying boxes and bags. Zoe moved closer, staying hidden behind trees and parked cars like she had done 3 weeks earlier. She could see Officer Rodriguez standing near one of the police cars, but something was very wrong. His hands were behind his back, and there were metal handcuffs around his wrists. 2 other officers were talking to him, but they didn't look friendly like he had been with Mrs. Wilson. They looked stern and official. One of them was reading from a piece of paper. "Carlos Rodriguez, you are under arrest for the murder of Elizabeth Wilson," the officer said in a loud, clear voice. "You have the right to remain silent." Zoe couldn't believe what she was hearing. Murder, Officer Rodriguez? The kind man who had spent an hour helping Mrs. Wilson and had promised to bring her purse to the hospital? She watched in shock as they put Officer Rodriguez into the back of a police car. Even from where she was hiding, she could see that he looked sad and confused. This couldn't be right. There had to be some mistake. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered to watch what was happening. Zoe could hear them talking among themselves. "I always knew there was something off about him," one woman said. "You can't trust any of them," a man replied. "They think their badge gives them the right to do whatever they want." Poor Mrs. Wilson, she probably trusted him because he was a police officer. Zoe wanted to run up to these people and tell them they were wrong. She wanted to explain what she had seen, how gentle and caring Officer Rodriguez had been, but she was just 8 years old and all these adults seemed so sure of what they were saying. The police cars drove away, taking Officer Rodriguez with them. The crowd began to break up, with neighbors returning to their homes while shaking their heads and continuing their conversations about what had happened. Zoe walked home in a daze. When she got there, her parents were watching the news on television. The reporter was standing in front of Mrs. Wilson's house, talking about the arrest. Officer Carlos Rodriguez, a 5-year veteran of the city police force, was arrested today in connection with the murder of 73-year-old Elizabeth Wilson, the reporter said. Police say Rodriguez was the last person to see Wilson alive, and evidence suggests he may have used his position as a police officer to gain access to her home. Zoe's father shook his head. "This is exactly what we've been talking about. You can't trust them. They act like they're there to help, but look what happens." "That poor woman," Carmen said sadly. She probably felt safe because he was wearing a uniform. She had no idea what kind of person he really was. Zoe couldn't stay quiet anymore, but he was nice to her. She burst out. "I saw him help her when she fell down." Her parents turned to look at her with surprise. "What are you talking about, honey?" Heikel asked. "I saw Officer Rodriguez help Mrs. Wilson a few weeks ago. She fell on the sidewalk and he stayed with her for a long time. He was really kind and gentle. He wouldn't hurt anyone." Carmen knelt down beside Zoe's chair. "Sweetie, sometimes people can seem nice on the outside but be very different on the inside. The police have evidence that this officer did something very bad." "But I saw him," Zoe insisted. "He gave her his jacket and picked up all her groceries and called her daughter and everything. He promised to bring her purse to the hospital." "Zoe," her father said firmly, "you're just a little girl. You don't understand how complicated these things can be. The police know what they're doing. If they arrested him, he must have done something wrong." Zoe felt tears starting to form in her eyes. Why wouldn't her parents believe her? She knew what she had seen. Officer Rodriguez had been nothing but kind to Mrs. Wilson. There was no way he could have hurt her. Over the next few days, the story was everywhere. It was on the news every night in the newspapers and all over social media. Everyone in the neighborhood was talking about it. The general feeling was relief that the killer had been caught so quickly, mixed with anger that a police officer could do such a thing. Zoe heard the adults talking about how this proved you couldn't trust the police. They said it showed that officers thought they were above the law and could get away with anything. Some people talked about how this was part of a bigger problem with law enforcement. But every night Zoe lay in bed thinking about that afternoon on Maple Avenue. She remembered every detail of Officer Rodriguez's kindness. She remembered how he had made Mrs. Wilson laugh, how he had sat on the dirty sidewalk in his clean uniform just to make her feel less alone. At school, the arrest was all anyone wanted to talk about. Kids shared stories they had heard from their parents about bad police officers. Teachers used it as an example of why it was important to be careful around strangers, even ones who seemed trustworthy. Zoe felt like she was the only person in the world who knew the truth about Officer Rodriguez. But she was just 8 years old, and everyone kept telling her she was too young to understand. One evening, about a week after the arrest, Zoe was watching television with her parents when a news story came on about Officer Rodriguez's wife. The reporter interviewed her outside their small house and she looked tired and sad. "My husband is a good man," the woman said, tears in her eyes. "He would never hurt anyone, especially not an elderly person. There's been some terrible mistake. She's just standing by her husband because she has to," Carmen said to the television. "Women always say these things when their husbands get arrested." But Zoe saw something different in the woman's face. She saw the same genuine sadness and confusion that she had noticed in Officer Rodriguez when they put him in the police car. These weren't the faces of people who were lying or trying to cover up something bad. These were the faces of people whose whole world had just fallen apart. As the days passed, Zoe began to realize that no one was going to listen to her story. The adults had all made up their minds about what had happened. They believed the evidence and the official story, and they weren't interested in hearing from a little girl who thought she had seen something different. But deep down, Zoe knew she had witnessed something important that day on Maple Avenue. She had seen the real Officer Rodriguez, the man who cared about people and went out of his way to help them. Whatever had happened to Mrs. Wilson, Zoe was certain that Officer Rodriguez hadn't done it. The problem was proving it. And for now, it seemed like no one wanted to hear the truth from an 8-year-old girl. 2 months had passed since Officer Rodriguez's arrest, and the neighborhood had become a very different place. What had once been a quiet, friendly community was now split down the middle, with neighbors taking sides in a debate that seemed to grow more heated each day. Zoe noticed the changes everywhere she went. At the corner store where her mom sometimes sent her to buy milk, the cashier and customers would stop their conversations when she walked in. She realized they had been talking about the case and they didn't want children to hear their discussions. At school, things were even more complicated. Some of her classmates came from families who believed Officer Rodriguez was guilty and dangerous. Others had parents who thought the whole case seemed suspicious and rushed. The playground had become a place where 8-year-olds repeated arguments they had heard at home, often not fully understanding what they were saying. "My dad says all cops are bad," Ashley told Zoe during lunch one day. "He says they think they can do whatever they want and get away with it." "But my uncle is a police officer," another classmate, Devin, replied. "He's not bad. He helps people all the time." "Well, this Rodriguez guy fooled everyone too," Ashley shot back. "That's what my mom says. She says he acted all nice and helpful, but really he was planning to hurt that old lady the whole time." Zoe listened to these conversations with growing frustration. She wanted to tell them what she had really seen. But every time she had tried to explain, adults had told her she was too young to understand or that she must have been confused about what happened. The divide in the community went much deeper than playground arguments, though. Zoe began to notice it during her walks home from school. Houses that had once displayed American flags or friendly garden decorations now showed signs supporting different causes. Some had signs that read "Justice for Betty Wilson," while others said "Innocent until proven guilty." The evening news seemed to make everything worse. Every night there were reports about the case, and each report seemed to make people more angry and more certain of their opinions. Zoe's parents watched these reports religiously, often inviting neighbors over to discuss what they had heard. "The evidence is pretty clear," their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, said during one of these evening gatherings. "Rodriguez was the last person to see her alive. He had access to her house. The timing all fits. But what about motive?" asked Mr. Johnson from down the street. "Why would he risk his career and his freedom to rob an old lady? It doesn't make sense." "Maybe it wasn't about money," Carmen suggested. "Maybe something went wrong. Maybe she recognized him from somewhere and threatened to report him for something else." Zoe listened to these conversations from her bedroom, where she was supposed to be doing homework. The adults always came up with new theories about why Officer Rodriguez might have hurt Mrs. Wilson, but none of their theories matched what Zoe had seen with her own eyes. The local newspaper made things even more complicated. They ran stories almost every day about the case, and each story seemed to present information that could be interpreted in different ways. One day, they would report about Officer Rodriguez's clean record and his community service. The next day, they would focus on the evidence against him and quotes from people who thought he was guilty. Zoe's father started buying the newspaper every morning, studying each article carefully and discussing it with anyone who would listen. "Look at this," he would say, pointing to a particular paragraph. "They're saying he had debts. Maybe that's why he needed money." But then, a few days later, another article would mention that the debts were small and that Officer Rodriguez had been making regular payments on them. The information seemed to change depending on who was telling the story and what point they were trying to make. At the grocery store, Zoe overheard two women talking while they waited in line to check out. "I feel so bad for his wife and kids," one of them said. "Even if he did it, they're innocent. But now everyone looks at them differently." "Well, she should have known what kind of man she married," the other woman replied. "There are always signs when someone is capable of violence." "But what if he didn't do it?" the first woman asked. "What if they arrested the wrong person? Then his family is suffering for nothing." "The police don't arrest people without good evidence," the second woman said confidently. "If they say he did it, he probably did it." These conversations made Zoe think about Officer Rodriguez's family. She had seen his wife on the news looking tired and sad as she left the courthouse or walked to her car. Zoe wondered what it must be like for his children to hear people talking about their father this way. At church, Pastor Williams tried to address the division in the community during his Sunday sermon. "We must remember that we are all neighbors," he said from the pulpit. "Regardless of what we believe about this case, we must continue to treat each other with respect and kindness." But even at church, Zoe could see the tension. Families who had been friends for years now sat in different sections. During the fellowship time after the service, people formed small groups based on their opinions about the case, and the conversations were often heated. Mrs. Rodriguez started coming to the same church around this time. Zoe recognized her from the news reports. She was a small woman with dark hair and kind eyes that always seemed to be holding back tears. She sat in the back row with two young children, a boy who looked about 10 and a girl who was maybe 6. Most of the congregation ignored Mrs. Rodriguez and her children, but a few people made a point of sitting near them and offering support. Zoe watched this with interest, noting how the same community that had once seemed united was now clearly divided into different camps. One Sunday, after the service ended, Zoe saw Mrs. Rodriguez's little girl crying in the bathroom. The girl was trying to wash something off her school backpack with paper towels and water from the sink. "What happened?" Zoe asked gently. "Someone wrote mean things on my backpack," the girl said between sobs. "They wrote that my daddy is a bad person. But he's not bad. He's the best daddy in the world." Zoe felt her heart break for this little girl who was probably about the same age she was. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said. "Some people don't understand. Do you think my daddy did something bad?" the girl asked, looking up at Zoe with big, hopeful eyes. Zoe thought about what she had witnessed on Maple Avenue. She remembered Officer Rodriguez's gentle voice and patient manner. She remembered how he had made Mrs. Wilson feel safe and cared for during a scary moment in her life. "No," Zoe said firmly. "I don't think your daddy did anything bad. I think he's a good person who helps people." The little girl smiled for the first time. "Thank you for saying that. Most people won't talk to us anymore." This conversation stayed with Zoe for days. She began to pay more attention to how the community was treating Officer Rodriguez's family. She noticed that other children avoided his kids at the playground near the church. She saw how Mrs. Rodriguez had to shop for groceries late in the evening, probably to avoid running into people who might say hurtful things. The local coffee shop, which had always been a gathering place for neighbors to chat and catch up, had become a place where people argued about the case. Zoe's mom stopped going there because she said the atmosphere had become too tense and unpleasant. "It's dividing the whole neighborhood," Carmen told her sister during a phone call that Zoe overheard. "People who have been friends for years are not speaking to each other. Everyone has an opinion and everyone thinks their opinion is the only correct one." "What do you think really happened?" Zoe's aunt asked. "I think the evidence speaks for itself," Carmen replied. "But I also think this whole situation is tragic for everyone involved. Even if he's guilty, his family doesn't deserve to be treated badly. Zoe appreciated that her mother showed compassion for Officer Rodriguez's family, but she still wished someone would listen to what she had seen. She had been thinking about that day on Maple Avenue every single day for months now, remembering every detail of Officer Rodriguez's kindness. At school, her teacher, Mrs. Peterson, decided to use the situation as a learning opportunity. She organized a class discussion about the importance of the justice system and how trials work. In America, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, she explained to the CLE. That means that even when someone is arrested, we have to wait for a trial to determine what really happened. But if the police arrested him, doesn't that mean he did it? Asked Tyler, one of Zoe's classmates. Not necessarily, Mrs. Peterson said carefully. Police officers arrest people when they have enough evidence to believe that person might have committed a crime. But sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes the evidence points to the wrong person. That's why we have trials and juries. This gave Zoe a little bit of hope. If Mrs. Peterson was right, then maybe there would be a chance for Officer Rodriguez to tell his side of the story. Maybe there would be an opportunity for the truth to come out. But as the weeks went by, it became clear that most people in the community had already made up their minds. They weren't waiting for a trial to decide what they believed. They had heard the evidence presented in the news and had drawn their own conclusions. Zoe realized that she might be the only person who had actually witnessed Officer Rodriguez's character firsthand. Everyone else was forming opinions based on what they had heard from others or read in the newspaper. But Zoe had seen with her own eyes how he treated Mrs. Wilson. She began to understand that this might be the most important thing she had ever witnessed in her young life. And she was starting to think that maybe, somehow, she would need to find a way to tell someone about it. 6 months had passed since Officer Rodriguez's arrest, and the day everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. The trial was beginning and the courthouse was buzzing with activity. News vans lined the street. Reporters stood ready with their cameras and crowds of people gathered outside holding signs and chanting slogans. Zoe had been thinking about this day for weeks. Her parents had been discussing the trial constantly, debating whether they should attend some of the proceedings to see justice being served. The whole community seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. "I think we should go," Michael told Carmen over breakfast the morning the trial started. "This affects our whole neighborhood. We have a right to be there." "I don't know," Carmen replied, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "It might be too intense. And what if there are protests or arguments outside the courthouse?" Zoe listened to this conversation while eating her cereal, her mind racing. She had been carrying the weight of what she had witnessed for 6 months now, and the burden was becoming heavier every day. She had tried multiple times to tell her parents about seeing Officer Rodriguez help Mrs. Wilson, but they always dismissed her account as the confused memory of a child. At school that day, it was impossible to concentrate on anything else. Mrs. Peterson had decided not to discuss the trial directly, but everyone knew what was happening downtown. During lunch, groups of children clustered together, sharing bits of information they had overheard from their parents. "My dad says they have video evidence," whispered Jake, a boy in Zoe's class. "My mom thinks he'll get life in prison," added another student. Zoe felt sick listening to these conversations. These were her classmates, kids she played with every day, and they were talking about sending a good man to prison forever, based on things they didn't really understand. After school, instead of going straight home, Zoe made a decision that would change everything. She walked to the courthouse. The building was impressive and intimidating, with tall stone columns and wide steps leading up to heavy wooden doors. There were still reporters and camera crews outside, though fewer than there had been that morning. Police officers stood at various positions, keeping watch over the crowds. Zoe approached one of the officers, a woman with a kind face and graying hair. "Excuse me," Zoe said, her voice small and uncertain. "Can children go inside the courthouse?" The officer looked down at her with surprise. "Well, yes, honey, but you need to be with an adult." "Are your parents here?" "No," Zoe admitted. "But I need to tell someone something important about the trial." The officer knelt down to Zoe's level. "What's your name, sweetie?" "Zoe Martinez. I live on Pine Street and I saw something important that nobody knows about." "What kind of something?" Zoe took a deep breath. "I saw Officer Rodriguez help Mrs. Wilson before she died. He was really nice to her and took care of her when she fell down. I don't think he hurt her. The officer's expression became more serious. Zoe, this is a very important trial with very serious charges. Are you sure about what you saw? Yes, ma'am. I saw it all happen. Officer Rodriguez helped her for a long time and was really gentle and kind. He couldn't have hurt her. The officer stood up and looked around thoughtfully. Zoe, I think you need to talk to someone about this. But first we need to call your parents. They're probably worried about where you are. 20 minutes later, Michael and Carmen arrived at the courthouse looking frantic and confused. They had been searching the neighborhood for Zoe when the police called to tell them where she was. Zoe Martinez, what in the world are you doing here? Carmen demanded, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. I had to come, Mom. I had to tell someone about Officer Rodriguez. Michael shook his head in frustration. Zoe, we've talked about this. You're just a little girl. You don't understand what's happening here. But the police officer who had been talking to Zoe interrupted. Actually, sir, your daughter has been very clear and consistent about what she says she witnessed. I think someone should listen to what she has to say. This led to a series of conversations that Zoe didn't fully understand. Her parents talked with several officials and eventually, a lawyer who was defending Officer Rodriguez came out to speak with them. The lawyer, a tall man with gray hair and a gentle manner, knelt down to talk to Zoe just like the police officer had done. Zoe, my name is Mr. Chen and I'm trying to help Officer Rodriguez. Can you tell me exactly what you saw? For the first time in 6 months, an adult was really listening to her. Zoe felt a mixture of relief and nervousness as she began to recount what she had witnessed on Maple Avenue. She told Mr. Chen about seeing Mrs. Wilson fall, about how Officer Rodriguez had rushed to help her, about the gentle way he had spoken to her and cared for her. She described how he had given Mrs. Wilson his jacket, how he had carefully collected her scattered groceries, and how he had sat on the dirty sidewalk in his clean uniform just to make her feel less alone. He made her laugh, Zoe said, remembering that moment clearly. He told her about his grandmother, and Mrs. Wilson actually laughed even though she was hurt and scared. Mr. Chen asked Zoe many questions, and she answered all of them with detailed memories of that afternoon. Her parents watched in amazement as their 8-year-old daughter provided information that no one else had been able to give. This is very important information, Zoe, Mr. Chen said finally. Would you be willing to tell a judge about what you saw? Zoe felt scared but determined. Yes, sir. I want to help Officer Rodriguez because I know he's a good person. The next morning, something unprecedented happened. Mr. Chen requested an emergency meeting with the judge to present new witness testimony. The courtroom, which had been packed with curious observers and members of the media, was cleared except for the essential people involved in the case. Zoe sat in the witness chair, which had been adjusted so she could reach the microphone properly. The judge, a stern-looking woman with kind eyes, explained to Zoe that she needed to tell the truth about everything she remembered. I understand you witnessed an interaction between Officer Rodriguez and Mrs. Wilson, the judge said gently. Can you tell us about that? Zoe took a deep breath and began her story. She spoke slowly and carefully, describing every detail she could remember from that day 6 months ago. The courtroom was completely silent as she talked, with everyone hanging on every word. She described how Officer Rodriguez had approached Mrs. Wilson with concern and gentleness. She talked about the way he had communicated with Mrs. Wilson's daughter on the phone, reassuring her that her mother was okay. She explained how he had promised to bring Mrs. Wilson's purse to the hospital and how genuinely he had seemed to care about her well-being. He wasn't pretending to be nice, Zoe said, looking directly at the judge. He really cared about her. You could tell by the way he talked to her and how patient he was. He treated her like she was his own grandma. The prosecutor asked Zoe several questions, trying to understand exactly when and where she had witnessed this interaction. They showed her maps and photographs to help establish the timeline and location of what she had seen. Zoe, are you absolutely certain this was the same Mrs. Wilson who was later found dead in her home? The prosecutor asked. Yes, sir. She told Officer Rodriguez her name was Betty Wilson, and that she lived on Oak Street. She had gray hair and blue eyes and a really nice voice. And you're certain this was Officer Rodriguez? Yes, sir. His name tag said Rodriguez, and he looks exactly the same as he does right now. Zoe pointed to Officer Rodriguez, who was sitting at the defendant's table. For the first time since the trial had begun, He was looking hopeful instead of defeated. The defense attorney asked Zoe to describe Officer Rodriguez's demeanor and behavior during the incident she had witnessed. "He was the kindest person I've ever seen," Zoe said honestly. "He wasn't in a hurry or acting like helping her was a bother. He actually seemed happy to help her. And when she was worried about bothering her daughter, he told her that daughters always want to know when their moms need help." As Zoe continued her testimony, she noticed that the mood in the courtroom was changing. People who had seemed certain of Officer Rodriguez's guilt were now looking confused and thoughtful. Even the prosecutor appeared to be reconsidering some of the assumptions the case had been built on. "Zoe, why didn't you tell anyone about this sooner?" the judge asked. "I tried to tell my parents, but they said I was too young to understand and that I must be confused. Every time I brought it up, adults would tell me that the police knew what they were doing and that I shouldn't worry about grown-up problems." This answer seemed to have a significant impact on everyone in the courtroom. The idea that a child's testimony had been dismissed simply because of her age appeared to make several people uncomfortable. After Zoe finished her testimony, the judge called for a recess. During the break, there was intense discussion among the lawyers and court officials. Zoe's testimony had introduced new information that hadn't been considered before, and it was clear that it was changing how people thought about the case. When court resumed, Mr. Chen presented a motion to re-examine all the evidence in light of Zoe's testimony. He argued that the case against Officer Rodriguez had been built on assumptions about his character and motivations that were contradicted by this eyewitness account of his genuine kindness toward Mrs. Wilson. This young witness has provided testimony that demonstrates Officer Rodriguez's authentic care and concern for the alleged victim, Mr. Chen told the court. Her account shows a man who went above and beyond his duties to help someone in need, not someone who was planning to harm that person. As Zoe sat in the courtroom, surrounded by adults who were finally listening to what she had been trying to tell them for months, she felt both relieved and nervous. She had done what she came to do. She had told the truth about what she witnessed. Now it was up to the adults to figure out what that truth meant for Officer Rodriguez and for justice. The day after Zoe's testimony, everything began to change. Her brave decision to speak up had created ripples that spread far beyond the courthouse walls. The local news stations, which had been covering the trial closely, now focused on the surprising testimony of an 8-year-old witness who had been trying to tell her story for months. Detective Johnson, who had been working on Mrs. Wilson's case since the beginning, sat in his office that morning reading the newspaper coverage of Zoe's testimony. Something about the little girl's detailed and heartfelt account bothered him, but not in a bad way. It bothered him because it made him realize that maybe they had been so focused on building a case against Officer Rodriguez that they hadn't looked hard enough for other possibilities. "Martinez," Detective Johnson called to his partner, "we need to go back through the Wilson case files. This kid's testimony has me thinking we might have missed something." Detective Martinez, no relation to Zoe, looked up from his computer. "You think the kid is telling the truth?" "Kids that age don't usually make up stories that detailed and consistent," Johnson replied. "And if Rodriguez really was as caring and genuine as she described, it doesn't fit with our theory about his motive." Meanwhile, across town, Zoe was back at school trying to have a normal day. But word had spread quickly through the community about her courthouse appearance, and she found herself at the center of attention in a way that made her uncomfortable. Some of her classmates looked at her with admiration. "You were so brave," Ashley told her at lunch. "I could never talk in front of a judge like that." But other children seemed confused or even upset. "My parents say you're wrong about that police officer," one boy said coldly. "They say he's definitely guilty and that you don't know what you're talking about." Mrs. Peterson pulled Zoe aside after class to talk privately. "Zoe, I heard about what happened yesterday at the courthouse. That must have been very scary for you." "It was scary," Zoe admitted, "but I had to tell them what I saw. Officer Rodriguez is a good person, and everyone was saying bad things about him that weren't true. You know, Zoe, it takes a lot of courage to speak up when you believe something is right, especially when it's difficult or when other people disagree with you. I'm proud of you for being so brave." This conversation meant a lot to Zoe. For months, adults had been telling her she was too young or too confused to understand what was happening. Having her teacher acknowledge her bravery felt like a small victory. But the real victory was happening downtown, where Detective Johnson and Detective Martinez were re-examining evidence they had previously overlooked. Zoe's testimony had prompted them to take a closer look at the timeline of Mrs. Wilson's final days and to consider other potential suspects. "Look at this," Detective Martinez said, pointing to a report on his desk. Mrs. Wilson's neighbor reported seeing someone suspicious near her house the night she was killed. "We interviewed him briefly, but we didn't follow up because we were so focused on Rodriguez." "What did the neighbor say?" "He said he saw a young man, maybe in his 20s, hanging around Mrs. Wilson's backyard around 10 o'clock that night. The guy seemed to be looking in her windows." Detective Johnson frowned. "Why didn't we pursue this more aggressively?" "Because we already had Rodriguez as a suspect and the evidence seemed to point to him. We figured the neighbor might have been mistaken about the timing or the person. They decided to re-interview the neighbor, Mr. Thompson, who lived next door to Mrs. Wilson. When they arrived at his house, he seemed surprised to see them again. "I thought you already solved the case," Mr. Thompson said as he invited them into his living room. "We're just double-checking some details," Detective Johnson explained. "Can you tell us again about the person you saw near Mrs. Wilson's house that night?" Mr. Thompson described a young man with dark hair who had been walking around Mrs. Wilson's property, looking in windows and trying door handles. "It was definitely not that police officer you arrested," he said firmly. This guy was much younger and skinnier. The detectives asked Mr. Thompson if he would be willing to work with a police artist to create a sketch of the person he had seen. 2 days later, they had a detailed drawing of a suspect who looked nothing like Officer Rodriguez. They showed the sketch to other neighbors, and several people recognized the young man as someone who had been seen in the area multiple times over the past few months, always seeming to be checking out different houses. This led them to review other break-ins and thefts in the neighborhood over the past year. They discovered a pattern of crimes committed by someone who fit the description Mr. Thompson had provided. The perpetrator seemed to target elderly residents living alone, and he had a history of escalating from simple burglary to more serious crimes. Meanwhile, the prosecution team was having serious discussions about the strength of their case. Zoe's testimony had introduced reasonable doubt about Officer Rodriguez's character and motivations, and now the defense team was requesting that all physical evidence be re-examined. "We need to be absolutely certain we have the right person," the lead prosecutor told her team. "If there's any chance we're prosecuting an innocent man, we have a responsibility to investigate further." The breakthrough came when Detective Martinez decided to run the DNA evidence from Mrs. Wilson's house through the database one more time, using updated search parameters. This time, they got a match. The DNA belonged to Kevin Wright, a 22-year-old man with a criminal record for burglary and assault. Wright had been in and out of jail for the past 3 years, and his last known address was in a neighborhood about 5 miles from where Mrs. Wilson had lived. When they brought Wright in for questioning, he initially denied being anywhere near Mrs. Wilson's house. But when confronted with the DNA evidence and Mr. Thompson's identification from a photo lineup, his story began to fall apart. After several hours of questioning, Wright finally confessed. He had been watching Mrs. Wilson's house for weeks, noting her routine and waiting for the right opportunity. On the night she was killed, he had intended to simply rob her while she was asleep, but she had woken up and surprised him. In his panic and fear of being identified, he had attacked her. "I never meant to hurt her," Wright said, tears streaming down his face. "I just wanted her money and jewelry. When she woke up and saw me, I got scared, and I just reacted." The news of Wright's confession spread through the community like wildfire. Officer Rodriguez, who had been sitting in jail for almost 7 months, was immediately released and all charges against him were dropped. Zoe was at home doing homework when her parents got the phone call from Mr. Chen, Officer Rodriguez's defense attorney. She could hear her mother's voice from the kitchen, alternating between surprise and what sounded like relief. "Zoe," Carmen called. "Can you come here for a minute?" Zoe found her parents sitting at the kitchen table looking stunned. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong, honey," Michael said, his voice soft with amazement. "Something very right has happened. They caught the real person who hurt Mrs. Wilson. Officer Rodriguez is innocent, just like you said." Zoe felt a mixture of relief, vindication, and sadness. She was happy that Officer Rodriguez was free, but she was also sad that it had taken so long and that he had suffered in jail for months while everyone believed he was guilty. Mr. Chen wants to thank you personally, Carmen continued. He says that if you hadn't been brave enough to speak up, an innocent man might have gone to prison for the rest of his life. The next day, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about the case. The headline read, "8-year-old's courage helps free." Innocent officer. The article described how Zoe's testimony had prompted investigators to re-examine the evidence and ultimately led to the arrest of the real perpetrator. But for Zoe, the most important moment came 3 days later, when Officer Rodriguez and his family came to visit her at home. She recognized his wife and children from church, and she was happy to see that they looked relieved and grateful instead of sad and worried. "Zoe," Officer Rodriguez said, kneeling down to her level just like the other adults had done at the courthouse, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saved my life and my family's life." "I just told the truth about what I saw," Zoe replied simply. "You were nice to Mrs. Wilson, and I knew you couldn't have hurt her." Officer Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears. "That day when I helped Mrs. Wilson, I was just doing what felt right. I never imagined that someone was watching and that it would someday matter so much." "I'm glad I was watching," Zoe said, "and I'm glad I finally got to tell someone about it." Officer Rodriguez returned to his job on the police force, but the experience had changed him. He started a program called Community Connections that brought police officers and neighborhood children together for activities and conversations. The goal was to help kids see police officers as real people who cared about their community, and to help officers better understand the families they served. Zoe became the first official member of the Community Connections program. She helped Officer Rodriguez organize events and activities, and she often shared her story with other children who were nervous about talking to police officers. The case had a lasting impact on the entire community. People realized how quickly they had rushed to judgment and how important it was to listen to all voices, even those of children. The experience taught everyone about the value of keeping an open mind and the danger of assumptions. Mrs. Peterson used the situation as a teaching moment for her class, discussing the importance of speaking up when you witness something important, regardless of your age. "Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages," she told her students. Zoe's parents were both proud and humbled by their daughter's actions. They realized they had almost dismissed something crucial simply because it came from a child, and they made a promise to always listen more carefully to what she had to say. The neighborhood eventually healed from the divisions that had developed during the case. People who had stopped speaking to each other began to have conversations again. The coffee shop returned to being a friendly, gathering place where neighbors could catch up on each other's lives without arguing about controversial topics. Officer Rodriguez never forgot the lesson he learned about the power of kindness and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. Mrs. Wilson's death was still a tragedy that affected everyone who knew her, but at least her memory was no longer associated with an innocent man's wrongful imprisonment. And Zoe learned that sometimes being brave means speaking up for what's right, even when you're small and no one seems to be listening. She discovered that the truth has a way of finding its path to the surface, especially when someone cares enough to keep telling it. Years later, when people in the community told the story of the little girl who saved an innocent man, they would always emphasize the same important lesson. Never underestimate the power of a child's voice, and never assume that someone is too young to witness something important or to understand the difference between right and wrong.